New Horizons. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. Today we're going to hear from John Azzolina from Blue Chip Consulting Group about SharePoint governance. Let's take a look at the agenda for today's webinar. So we're going to talk just for a couple of minutes about New Horizons and what we do as a training company. Then I'll pass things over to John, who's got an excellent presentation for you today, and then he'll go over some Q&A to wrap things up. So New Horizons is the world's largest independent training company. Hopefully all of you have taken training with us before. We're a proven worldwide training provider with flexible learning solutions covering a broad spectrum of topics taught by industry-leading instructors. And here's some facts to consider. Again, we're the largest international network in training today. We have over 2,100 classrooms internationally, over 2,400 instructors spread around the world, and we provide over 3 million student days of training per year. So we have a flexible, integrated learning methods. We have quite a few ways to get you the content that you're looking for. We have, of course, traditional instructor-led training, but mostly what we do is online. We have an online live virtual delivery model which provides over 80% of our training. New Horizons has been delivering classes online longer than any other training provider, and we do it every day. One of the other things we specialize in is providing private group training, which is completely customized for your organization so you can learn with your content the way you'd like to. One of the things that really separates us are the strong vendor partnerships that we maintain. So pictured here are a few of the companies that we work with. We're Microsoft Gold Partner, have been for a very long time, and Citrix and VMware and the rest of that. So we teach authorized vendor content. That means that we deliver you the content that comes direct from the vendors to help you achieve your certification goals or push your company forward with whatever training initiatives that you might have. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to John, who's going to take us through a little introduction on Blue Chip and then talk to us about SharePoint governance. John, over to you.
Of SharePoint. I've worked on a number of SharePoint implementations, and wanted to go through. Looks like I might have been on mute there for a while, but that's all right. It was just Blue Chip stuff. We can circle back on that at the end. Thanks, Brian. So today our agenda is we're going to talk a little bit about what governance is. What do we mean when we say governance? We're going to talk about the 3 legs of SharePoint governance, what make up the 3 components of a good governance plan. And we'll wrap up with just a single slide on managing that governance plan and how we manage it going forward. The idea here, what I'd like you to take away are 2 things. One, I want to make sure that you have a good, solid overview of the governance process. And 2, I want to make sure that you have this slide deck provides a level of detail, I hope, that'll help you get started writing your own governance plan. So what is governance? Well, governance is essentially a set of policies, processes, roles, and responsibilities that control how a system is governed. It essentially lets you know who needs to be where, when, and what folks need to be doing to make sure that your system is running in an optimal way. Having that documented in a single location makes it easy to find and helps you answer questions about what, how you need to proceed, how you need to go forward with the system. Essentially, as we talked about a second ago, governance covers, in SharePoint, governance covers 3 key topic areas: information technology, information management, and application management. Information technology is the service portion of SharePoint. It's standing up the servers. It's making sure that things are patched, that you have disaster recovery straightened away, that you don't have folks on the network running their own copies of SharePoint. Information management is a little bit different. It's not. It's a newer concept in terms of SharePoint, and it's the idea that SharePoint works best and runs best when organizations take a proactive role in owning their information and managing how that information is distributed to the enterprise, how it's categorized and organized. It's a big part of making SharePoint work effectively for your organization. The last piece is application management. SharePoint is more than a collaboration platform. SharePoint is it's an application development platform. It allows you to build applications and build functionality for your organization much, much faster than we're able to do if we have to stand everything up from scratch. And managing those applications and managing the process by which those applications are built, it goes a long way towards, again, making SharePoint work for you as opposed to manage you. So I like to talk about the idea of why do governance, and sometimes when you're talking, especially to the business, that idea of policies, procedures, roles, and responsibilities can get a little cumbersome. And one of the things I'd like to make sure we're keeping forefront in our mind here is that we have to be able to talk to not just the technical side of the house. We have to be able to talk to the business. And governance for SharePoint is worth the time that you need to get from the business, because at the end of the day, it reduces risks while maximizing the value of the system. And all policies that you write in the governance process should be looked at through this window. Does the policy maximize the value of the system while reducing risks? Conflict within a governance process, and believe me, there's always a fair amount of conflict within, as you're trying to design these governance plans, can also be measured and evaluated in terms of value versus risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about an organization's principles and aligning that, but at the end of the day, this is why you take the time, the energy to go through this, what can be sometimes a daunting process of creating governance, an explicit governance plan. Okay. At a more detailed level, and a more technical level, what are we trying to get out of SharePoint governance? Well, for one, we're trying to streamline the deployment. Having a solid governance plan in place specifies those services that you're going to deploy, those services that you are going to disable. So what you get from a governance plan is guidance on how your SharePoint implementation and deployment should take shape. So you avoid that situation where we go in and we install it, we turn everything on, and now we're not sure how we manage things, we're not sure how services should be configured. Your governance plan doesn't define an infrastructure plan, but it provides guidance and input into creating that plan so that your deployments, at the end of the day, they'll go much more smoothly. Governance is about keeping the system secure and compliant. Governance is a lot of communication to the users. talking to users about the kinds of things they can and can't do, the kinds of things they can put into SharePoint versus the kinds of things that should stay in other purpose-built systems. So in many organizations, SharePoint is deployed as a collaboration environment, and transactional, personally identifiable data of customers is kept in other systems that are more strictly managed. And that way, you can open SharePoint up a little bit more. You can make it more flexible. It'll meet users' needs more easily. And you keep that private personal data in other systems that are designed to be more stringently maintained. And so governance helps you define what kind of data you will allow, what kind of data you won't, what it means for the system to be secure, and what compliance rules and regulatory issues you need to address. And each industry is going to have different rules and different processes that you'll need to pay attention to, and those should feed into the governance plan, and they should be addressed in your governance plan. Again, we talked about ensuring the best return on your investment, right? So again, it's about maximizing value. The last point there, I think, is the most important point on the slide. It's the idea of aligning SharePoint with organizational goals and principles. One of the great features of the product is that it's so flexible, and it has this promise of delivering tremendous operational improvements to end users in terms of self-service in the role in the realm of IT. The ability to, I can set up my own site, I can set up my own environment for document sharing within my department, and I can do my, my own small applications within lists and libraries. But not all organizations are ready. Not all organizations are prepared for that level of flexibility. Sometimes an organization needs to take measured steps and be more careful and be more judicious about how they deploy tools like SharePoint to ensure optimal adoption, right? At the end of the day, one of the best ways to drive value in SharePoint is to have people using it. And adoption is driven by meeting people where they are, giving them the tools they need, and not overwhelming them. And so part of governance should be to make sure you're looking at where your organization is and aligning the services and the features of SharePoint that you will deploy to where your organization is. To bring it down to a detailed level, publishing is a great example. We have discussions with customers every time we go into an organization to do a governance facilitation around publishing. And what is the role of publishing within SharePoint? Publishing can be, for some users and some organizations, a fairly complex feature that introduces significant layers of complexity. It's a good idea to have a detailed conversation about whether or not you're going to turn publishing on, and in what context will you turn it on, where will you require it to make sure there are appropriate controls on content, and where will you make it optional, and where will you advise people not to use it. So we'll try to put in some practical examples here, and that's one example of where the organization is really, is going to depend on the policies you put into place. Okay, when you get started thinking about building a SharePoint governance plan, a couple things to think about. One, creating a meaningful governance plan is very, very difficult unless the folks that are involved in doing this have a basic understanding of SharePoint. This is one of the reasons why folks, while we've done engagements, outside firms can bring that knowledge in if your organization has never deployed governance or never deployed SharePoint in the past. Proof of concepts are also a great way to establish a baseline level of familiarity with SharePoint. So we've seen many customers that will do an internal, say, IT-only SharePoint implementation to get familiar for a few months with the tool so that they can help the business and facilitate when it comes to writing these governance plans. So that's one thing. You can't go into this completely with no knowledge at all. You need commitment, right? So you need commitment from leadership, from business, and from IT. That you need folks from all three segments of your organization that are willing to contribute to the governance plan. Otherwise, you get a lopsided document. Each one of these organizations within the business has different priorities, different goals, and probably different ideas of what the most appropriate uses for SharePoint are, and probably some fairly strong ideas about what inappropriate uses would be. And so you've got to go out to each one of these. Not only do you need participation, but you need commitment from each segment that they're going to participate in governance meetings, governance sessions, that they'll review the plan, that they'll sign off on the plan, and that they will abide by the plan. Last but not least, governance is about balancing competing interests. And the process of creating a governance plan, unless you're going to lock yourself away in a room by yourself and write the whole thing and then just dictate it to everybody, you need someone with strong facilitation skills that can lead your organization through conflicts and arrive wherever possible at consensus. It can be a challenging business to get everyone to agree or everyone to settle on a compromise policy that meets everybody's needs. So there's that. Okay, so in order to get started, there's a couple of things at the outset that you should consider, and at the very minimum you need to plan for. So the first thing is that creating a governance plan is going to require you as an organization to determine your initial principles and goals. And again, there are conflicts between open information access and system security, between end user power and access to tools, and an organization's need to control data within the organization. There are issues with cost versus features and functionality. And so one of the things you need to be prepared for when you get started is the idea that you will need to have a conversation about what are your goals for deploying SharePoint? What do you want to accomplish? And what are the overriding principles of your organization when it comes to specifically deploying IT tools and deploying software? That's one item. Second, you need to be aware that you will get the most benefit out of this process if you spend the time to classify your business information. We've had some customers that take a very straightforward approach to this. They have 3 levels of classification: public, internal, and sensitive. We have other customers that create fairly sophisticated tiered hierarchies of information classification that are driven by the section of the business that they're used in, by the purpose of the document, whether it's a draft or it's in progress. But to really get the most out of a governance process and to create a solid plan, you need to, as you're getting started, you really need to think about how are you going to classify the information within your business. And then the business folks in an organization are going to have a lot to say about that, and that's something that you want to make sure that you include them in this process. This is not something that can be driven solely by IT. You'll need to develop, as part of your governance plan, and getting started even, an education and support strategy. You need to be able to, again, bring the participants in the governance process up to at least a minimum level of familiarity with SharePoint. You need to make sure that you provide, again, at the very minimum, those participants in the governance process with a support strategy. Let them know where they can go to get help throughout the governance process so that they don't feel like they're out on an island all by themselves. And looking towards the future, the governance plan needs to address how are you going to train your users, how do you support your users. And by looking at that early on, you can get ahead of that issue and make sure that, again, you're maximizing adoption because folks know how to use the system. Last but not least, even at the very beginning of the process, still need to have the end in mind. And part of the end, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is the idea of a governance plan is not very much good if you write it and put it in a drawer and never look at it again. So you need to make sure that throughout the entire process, you're considering how are we going to manage these policies, how are we going to monitor the adherence to these policies, the effectiveness of these policies, and how are we going to change these policies if we need to. So there's that. Okay. So now let's talk about the governance of an architecture plan. The architecture of governance plan, excuse me. So the architecture of this plan is, again, it's 3 pieces. Each piece, whether it's information technology, information management, or application management, each one of those pieces is comprised of individual policies. A government document is essentially a list of policies. Each policy contains a title, so you can talk about it intelligently. It contains a purpose. So why did the team feel that they needed this particular policy? A definition of the policy, and a policy owner. So at the end of the day, every policy within a document, at the very minimum, needs to have someone, a role within your organization that owns that policy. This is a template, it's a guide. You can get more sophisticated if you want to. We have had customers that include a references section for each and every policy so that folks that are looking at the policy can go out to Microsoft's site or go out to other reference material and read more about the implications of a given policy. We've had customers that have not only assigned a policy owner, they assign a policy author, so the person who's always in charge of writing that, and they differentiate or distinguish an author from an owner. An author writes the policy, the owner is in charge of enforcing the policy and monitoring the policy. So those are the, each one of the topics we'll talk about next is going to essentially at some point become a policy, and these are the pieces that you'll need to be able to properly make sense of it. Okay. Information technology governance answers a couple questions. Who's going to govern and oversee the service? So essentially, the IT piece of it really needs to define at a low level the roles. Who is going to do the work? Who is responsible for each of the different areas of SharePoint? How are you going to communicate these policies to the users? So you can't just write the document. A lot of times governance documents are 40, 50, 60, 80 pages long. You're not going to be very successful if you write it, post it out as a PDF, and hope folks are going to come and read them. So what types of training are you going to do? We've had some customers publish wikis. We've had some folks do dedicated training on specific high-impact governance policies, but IT generally runs that process, so they need to consider how are you going to do that. How are you going to encourage user adoption of SharePoint? What is your rollout strategy? How are you going to encourage folks to use the system, and how are you going to prevent, depending on how large your organization is, how are you going to prevent other areas of your organization from installing SharePoint? Microsoft's got some great technical tools that do that, but you need to make sure that you put a policy in place and that you plan to use that policy. So what policies will you find in this section? You're going to find security infrastructure policies. So, who can log into the system? Are you going to make the system available externally? Are you going to make it available to contractors? Will you make it available to only certain sections of your internal audience? What are your data protection and disaster recovery policies? Not only, hey, yes, we'll do disaster recovery, but what are your, how long will it take to bring data up? How granular will your recovery processes be? Will you be able to recover a single site or a single site collection or a single list? If someone, has a problem and they want to go back and recover those things. There's different settings and configurations that need to be planned on for different levels of recovery. What are your policies in terms of sites? Who gets the site? Why would you get a site? What will you use sites for? What will your storage quotas be? Will everybody get the same 10 gigs of storage, or will you have different levels of organizational units? What often are you going to update? How much testing will you do when you put a patch into place? For large organizations with significant compliance burdens, they probably have a patch management process in place, and there's testing that goes through the various environments, and in that case you may simply refer to that existing process. In smaller organizations where patch management is a little bit more haphazard, by having a defined policy, you can set users' expectations for when you're doing this, when they can experience system downtime, and get a better handle on that process. Also part of information technology are service level agreement policies. So what does the approval process look like for new sites? Are you going to turn on self-service site collection provisioning and walk away? Or are you going to have a fairly sophisticated process for receiving site requests, evaluating them, approving them, and provisioning them? And what kind of training requirements will you have before you provision someone with a new SharePoint site? We've seen some organizations that are rolling SharePoint out for the first time that have very stringent training requirements before they'll provide users with a site. We have other customers that they've been, they rolled out a very vanilla form of SharePoint 5 years ago, and now they're, they've implemented a request process, and nobody needs any training because it's baked into the culture of the organization. Each organization will be different. What are the costs and chargebacks for departments when they request a site or when they request support? Do you have no process for that? Are you going, does your company already have a process and you'll refer to it, or is it something that you want to stand up when you stand up SharePoint? Some people, it's brand new, and that's a process that requires a significant amount of documentation and planning. What are your problem resolution and support policies? Again, letting people know what they can expect. How long, should I expect to wait to get a resolution in a SharePoint issue? What are the downtime in service windows? So this is a big one. SharePoint allows people to work wherever. If folks can get into your network, they've got access to the environment, and you may have folks that want to know if they can be doing stuff on Saturday afternoon at 4:30. So making sure that you're explicit about what your service windows are and when folks can expect system downtime is important. Other items are multilingual support. Are you going to support multiple languages in your environment? We have some customers that, for simplicity's sake, they're domestic environments. They don't do any. And then we have other customers that are global and need to very carefully define what language packs they're going to support. Again, what are your storage limits, and also what are your performance targets? SharePoint is, has a significant opportunity for customization and has many different ways to deploy the infrastructure, all of which are going to have impacts on both cost and performance. So documenting what your expected performance target is going to be a great input into the infrastructure discussion, and it's going to help set expectations for your end users. So what we want to do at the end of the day, when we're done with information governance, is we want to make sure that we've answered a number of questions. So information management governance is that idea of how do we manage data within our organization. When we're done, we want to know how do we make our data as usable and manageable as possible. Who has access to the information and why, right? So understanding what your rules are and what your policies are about who is given access to what types of information is important. It's important to know for audit purposes. It's important to know to protect yourself from the risk of exposed data, which has been a big point lately in the news. What are we making available internally versus externally? Are you going to have external components to SharePoint? Those, that is an undertaking that requires you to think carefully about how your organization is going to expose its data and what risks does that present. Information management should address the task of finding information within your organization. How easy is it to find information within your organization? SharePoint governance and deploying SharePoint or standing up a governance plan is an excellent opportunity to do some assessment of how your data is structured and how easy is it to find things within your organization. Last, information management is about managing risk, right? And so it's about making things easy to find, but how do you manage the risk of data being exposed to the outside world? It's a difficult thing to do, and those organizations are most at risk that haven't given this issue any consideration. So within each organization, it's going to be different. Each organization really needs to define what is sensitive information versus public information, because you have to walk a fine line between control and access. If you create a system that it's impossible to get data out to the external world, it's probably going to be cumbersome. People won't use it. So you'll defeat yourself because folks will carry things around on thumb drives rather than using SharePoint because the security model in SharePoint is too cumbersome. So you've got to decide where your organization falls within, within that spectrum of control and access. Specific things that you want policies on within SharePoint. Manage metadata. How are you going to use managed metadata? What types of controls will you have over managed metadata? Oftentimes, organizations err on the side of control. They want to make sure that they lock down what folks are adding to the managed metadata lists. And at the outset, that might work out well, but as folks become more comfortable with SharePoint, that can slow productivity. So we've had some customers that will put policies in with timelines where they'll talk about what they're going to do in the initial deploy, what they'll do for the first 6 months after the initial deploy, and then what they'll do after, oftentimes based on some assessment at that point, to open the system up to a little bit more control by end users. So also search keywords. Who's going to manage search? I mean, search is a big topic in SharePoint. Keywords is just one possible policy that I pulled out. But how are you going? Who's going to be responsible for managing search keywords and things like best bets? Who's going to be responsible for reviewing the search logs and seeing what's trending in search? How are you going to manage that? Are you going to put a lot of that responsibility into the hands of business users, into the hands of super users? Or are you going to hold that within a purpose-driven role that you create within your IT organization? There's lots of different ways to handle it, and again, having an explicit plan is going to create a much better search experience for your users. Content types. How are you going to manage content types? Information architecture in SharePoint is driven in large part by content types. Are you going to leverage the content type hub? If so, what are your policies going to be around adding new enterprise content types? Who's going to be allowed to do that? How are they going to do that? What will your policies be around site-level content types created by site owners? Are you going to allow those to proliferate with the risk of duplication and confusion, or are you going to write policies that assert tighter control? The other piece of that pie, of course, and this is a great place to talk about it, is some policies are more difficult to enforce than others. And this is a great example of content types. You can give folks guidance on the creation or non-creation of content types, but with folks with enough permissions, it's fairly difficult to completely prevent them from creating new ones. If you want to create a policy that really restricts the use of content types, that may be a policy that you need to implement, via education, as opposed to being able to implement it solely through technology. And so that's another question you have to ask, particularly in the information architecture section. Can you manage these policies? Can you enforce them? Who's going to monitor them? And this is a great example. Other policies, retention policies. Are you going to set up retention policies that drive how long documents will live in SharePoint? What will happen at the end of those retention policies? How will you leverage record centers? All of these features provide significant value to an organization, but also present risks, and can be set up in such a way as to be daunting for user adoption. So sitting down, and again, with the business, it's a process of business and leadership and IT sitting down and talking through these policies, these features. And many times it's a job for IT to educate business users about what the risks and implications of policies are. This is one of those areas where you'll really need to be able to communicate well with your business users. Well, if we put retention policies on, this is how it's going to work, this is what's going to happen, documents will get deleted or they'll get put into the recycle bin, and understanding how these features work and being able to communicate them to the business is really important to having this process run smoothly. Other information management policies. So personally identifiable information and other data that is controlled by regulatory regimes. This is an important thing to make sure you have a good handle on within SharePoint. These are things that are you going to put customer data into SharePoint, and what type of customer data will you put in? What are the implications for that type of data within your organization? For distributors, for manufacturers, oftentimes there are little or no implications whatsoever. For financial services companies, for healthcare organizations, the implications of storing patient data or customer data within SharePoint is significant and needs to be tightly controlled. Metadata and document tagging. Again, we talked a little bit about managed metadata on the last slide. Again, what type of document tagging are you going to support? What type of metadata will you support? What will you have at the beginning, when you first deploy SharePoint? How do you project that to grow or change over time? What does your organization absolutely need to require versus what is a nice to have in terms of metadata are important questions to ask. Other items, policies around document versioning. We've had some organizations that flat out require document versioning to be turned on every single document library within the entire organization, full stop, because it's very critical to see what the evolution of a document is within their organization. We've had others that go completely the other direction, and they do no document versioning because they don't want to, the storage issues, they can't yet address those. So what, are you going to require them? Will it be optional? Are there certain circumstances within your organization where you want to require versioning? Same for organization folder structure guidelines. oftentimes, given the nature of SharePoint, this is something very, very difficult to enforce. We've had customers try with limited success in most cases to dictate a standard, if you will, folder structure. Because of the end user control available within SharePoint, it's difficult to dictate and enforce, but will you have guidelines that you put out to folks about what are the optimal ways to structure their environments? Same goes for navigation. We've walked into SharePoint environments where we've got quick launch bars that have 45 items in them, and they're nearly impossible to use. We have so providing your users with guidelines, policies around what the best way to use navigation is. That, for example, we've had a policy we wrote just recently that talked about the quick launch bar is always to be leveraged to there needs to be a link to every list or library on the site, but don't get too crazy otherwise. And that top level navigation was limited to global navigation and was specified by the requirements of the site. So you can create those guidelines for navigation to create consistency and really increase usability within your organization. Policies around search strategy, we talked about that a little earlier, and publishing we also mentioned. So again, in which sections of the site is publishing going to be important and which not. Many times when folks are considering that intranet replacement project where they're doing a lot of one-to-many communication, publishing, they write a policy that says in that environment we'll turn publishing on, but in collaboration and team sites and project sites we'll leave publishing up to the users. And so having that defined ahead of time is nice because it lets you know what training you need to do. It lets you know what users can expect in different environments. And again, the whole idea is it makes this transition easier. Okay, so information architecture, some good information architecture has effective, intuitive folder structures. It has reasonable metadata requirements. My personal definition of that is no more than 3 required metadata fields for any given content type, but your organization may differ. And simple and clear permissions guidelines. And then policies around what permission levels you'll have, what the default groups available within a site are. All of these things you want to define them up front. And if you've got simple, clear guidelines, you're going to be better off. Ineffective, right? Library structures that are difficult to navigate. We've had some folks that actually dictate a very complex folder structure to try to anticipate issues, and you end up with a lot of folders that don't get used. You end up with a lot of confusion about where things ought to go. So keeping that simple and intuitive is important. No metadata. So we've had folks that have no metadata whatsoever. We've had other folks that have 20 required metadata fields. So every time you save a document up, it's a it's a 5-minute process to categorize and quantify that document. That gets in the way of folks doing their work, and oftentimes it's overkill. Highly variable permission levels are also problematic, right? Particularly for support and troubleshooting. If you've got every site or every list with broken inheritance and specific, member level permissions, it becomes very difficult to troubleshoot why something's not working or why I can't see a document. You get conversations like, well, I went to look for that document, but it wasn't there because that person didn't have permissions. And so setting policies around how site owners should use permissions, what is expected within an organization, can help you avoid a lot of those issues. Okay. Last section is application management governance. And this essentially goes to how you will manage the things that your organization builds or buys to implement within SharePoint. 4 key items here: customization, lifecycle management, branding, and development methodology. So customization it's essentially everything you do after you do your initial setup and deploy of SharePoint, in my view. And so it's things that users do through the user interface to customize pages. It's things that someone might do with SharePoint Designer to customize lists, to change list forms, and it's something that someone might do in terms of creating event receivers or other Visual Studio-based customizations that require code and deployment. Customization is also branding. So it's getting in and changing that master page, changing that look and feel. In terms of customization, what are you going to allow folks to do? What tools will you allow in your organization? It's unlikely you want to allow every end user to go out and grab a copy of Visual Studio and start coding up their own event receivers. That's probably something you want to lock down. A more difficult question is, will you allow end users to use SharePoint Designer? And in what cases will you allow SharePoint Designer to be used? We have some customers that completely disallow that. And we have other customers that, if you're a site owner or above, you can use SharePoint Designer. So there's different levels that you can take there, different approaches depending on how flexible and how savvy your users are. What will your testing and deployment policies be? Again, some organizations have implemented formal change management processes, and in those cases, your governance plan oftentimes can just reference those. You say, hey, look, we have we use IDLE, or we use a CAB process, and we use Microsoft's waterfall process, whatever, and this process will be applied to SharePoint, and here's where all the, here's the development servers, here's the test server, here's the QA server, here's the production server. You can define that in governance. Or if you're an organization that doesn't do a lot of custom work, you may have to create a custom deployment process for SharePoint and really work through what environments will you have. Will you have a QA environment? Will you have a separate pre-production environment? We've seen environments that have as many as 5 different SharePoint servers, all for a different purpose. We've seen environments with 1. What will your support policies be when folks do customize things? So we have customers that give their users a lot of leeway, but put it on the user to then support themselves. So we have some customers that say, yeah, you can use SharePoint Designer, but SharePoint Designer is not something help desk will support. You'll need to work through those issues, on your own if that's the direction you take. So defining how you're going to support customizations that users make so that they can go into it with their eyes open and a clear set of expectations is important. Using the app catalog in the SharePoint store. Are you going to allow folks to use the app catalog? Will you allow them to go buy new applications and deploy them in your environment? Will you have any kind of vetting process or approval process before folks go and do that? That's important to understand before you deploy SharePoint. Lifecycle. We talked a little bit about this in the testing and development, so some of this stuff we've covered, but a big one is who has access to the environments. Critical for infrastructure teams, important for development teams to understand who's going to have access to production, who will have access to QA environments, who moves custom code through that environment, whose responsibility is that. Again, many organizations, they have clear-cut guidelines on this, and governance plans, SharePoint governance plans, should not try to replicate that. Reference existing policy where possible. Another big one is how are you going to synchronize the environments? SharePoint provides some challenges in that data in a production environment can, in some cases, be difficult to get into QA and test and development environments. So what's your process going to be for refreshing those QA environments or those development environments periodically? How are you going to control source code? So do you already have a source control system in place? If so, how will you manage declarative assets within SharePoint, which sometimes might not fit into a source control system in a traditional way? So you'll have to work through those issues and policies as well. Branding. Who's responsible for the visual design? Are you going to let every user have complete freedom with every single site that they do? Or will you enforce a level of consistency across your entire SharePoint deployment? You know, a big thing that goes into that discussion is a consistency of user experience. So we've had some customers that, you know, provide a high level of customization, a high level of permissions to their users, and because they want to give folks control and they want people to take ownership over their sites. But at the end of the day, it becomes very difficult for users to transition from one project site to another because the customization is so high, the navigation is all different, the look and feel might be different. So many organizations choose to standardize and create consistent branding, not just for, you know, how things look, but because it increases usability and consistency. Last on the application management is the development methodology. So you want to have clear-cut guidelines about how you will do development in SharePoint. Will you build a solution or an app? And in what situations is a solution a more appropriate choice than building an app? In what cases is building an app more effective? Are you going to use sandbox solutions or farm solutions or both? And in what scenarios? In what situations would you use one versus the other? If you are doing significant development, these types of policies contribute significantly to consistency and standardization across your code base for SharePoint and make it easy for folks to pick up where other people have left off, right? In larger environments where developers have complete free reign to build whatever kind of thing they feel like that day, as long as it works in SharePoint, you get a significant, you can have a tremendous amount of variation within how solutions are developed. Somebody decided to use Knockout, somebody else wanted to use jQuery, somebody else wanted to use the the client-side object model with whatever JavaScript library they felt was fun that day, will at the end of the day add significantly to your costs. Last piece, managing the governance plan. So this last slide talks about the idea of how are you going to manage. Your governance plan needs to address itself. It needs to address how it will be managed over time. How are you going to write new policies? Who's responsible for deciding when a new policy needs to be put in place? Oftentimes you see a governance board that is set up as part of the roles and responsibilities section of the document. How are they monitored? How are you determining whether or not a policy is problematic? How are you going to make sure policies are effective? And who enforces the policies? And do they have the political capital within the organization to be able to enforce the policies? All of these questions should be addressed within your governance plan so you can keep it a living document and really reap the benefits of it. That is all of the content that I had today. There was what we'd like to know. The folks at New Horizons are particularly interested, and if you'd use the comment window to signal with just a Y or a no, a Y or an N, a yes or a no. Are there any folks out there listening to this webinar today that would be interested in participating in a SharePoint governance class? We're trying to gauge the interest on that, and if you could in the chat window just indicate with a Y or an N, that would be phenomenal. But at this point, I know I ran a little bit longer than I expected, but we do have a few minutes for Q&A. Or Brian, if you want to wrap up, that's all I have to present today. Thanks everyone for your time. I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, you can always find Blue Chip online, bluechip-llc.com, and you can reach out directly to New Horizons or directly to myself. But thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, we really would appreciate it if you could just throw a Y in the chat window if you would be interested in seeing maybe a 3-day SharePoint governance class to take these ideas that John presented and maybe expand on those a little bit. So that's something that we were looking at. We certainly use these webinars to try to gauge audience interest, and being that we had an excellent turnout today, that's certainly something that we would be willing to investigate. So if there's any questions, please include those in the chat window as well. But once again, we'd like to thank John for his time and all of you for yours as well. Please check out our webinar schedules on various New Horizons websites around our network. And we look forward to seeing you again. I don't currently see any questions in the chat window. John, I think we are good to go, but if you could, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure.